Hey all, this is a video about Rails routing, and it's going to be probably a part one since there is so much to this concept and how Rails works. The concept of routing is not a new thing. It's basically been something that's in like web applications have been a thing for quite a while. But the idea behind it in Rails specifically is just to generate a lot of stuff for you so you don't have to spend time configuring your app, getting parameters and URLs and paths correct. Rails just kind of handles that for you, assuming you set it up correctly in the configuration. There's just some basics to know out of the gate that just take care of a lot for you. But there's also some advanced things that are worth knowing that I've kind of want to go through together, at least just kind of more of a review type of video as opposed to a tutorial in this case. That is just kind of talking through the docs and understanding it a bit more. So if you're ever puzzled about how something works, maybe I can explain it a little better. I probably won't be able to touch absolutely everything here. There's obviously documentation for that reason, but there's a bunch here that I want to talk to that I think is pretty neat and cool to at least go over. Instead of going right through the docs, I've made another actual app that I have a routes file for. This is just part of my template that I use. There's a mess of comments in here just to support some of my talking points, but hopefully it's useful. If it's not, we can maybe try another approach coming up where I just actually build something with, specific routes. That seems more time consuming and less necessary, so to speak, as opposed to this. But let me know if that would be helpful. To start my app, when I run my template on the side, if you're not used to me or haven't heard of me before, I've used this template that I've used in the past that kind of kicks off a new Rails app and just saves me a bunch of time for configuring things and setting things up. One of those things that does is adds devise. So there's actually a helper method here for devise that adds a ton of routing built into the Ruby gem that is used for. That just adds all your routes for like logging in, signing out, signing in, signing up, all those things. Just for you, and it's just a one-liner, and it's pretty neat how it works. And that's the point of configuring this. Like Rails makes it quite easy to add, like in one line you can add, I don't know, like 6 different routing patterns to your app. The idea is you can create, read, update, and destroy resources on an actual object. So the idea there is either save something to a database, pull it from a database, delete it from a database, edit it, update it, all those things. And that's kind of a common software pattern is RESTful routing. There's this new thing called GraphQL, which is a little bit different in the scope of it's more of a query language that you can do from a single endpoint. RESTful is a bunch of endpoints that have specific purposes. So those are the kind of the bigger things that are different with those. More on that in probably a different video or topic or blog or something coming up. So why do we need routing specifically? Honestly, this construct is mostly just a time saver. The idea of this could be all hand coded. You could pass in certain variables during a request and everything would be fine. But the idea of this is just going to kind of handle that for you. Rails does a great job of it. And it's honestly one of the best parts of using Rails to me because you can quickly add a new route, generate something fast, get something up, and have something to show for it in like less than 5 minutes if you want. It gets complex from there, but it can be very simple at the same time. So the probably the obvious one to start with here is the root path. That's one that's always just going to be present in a Rails app. You can have multiple based on if you're using devise, for instance, like an authenticated user could have a different root path than an actual just default user who isn't signed in, which is pretty neat, but it's not required. And for the sake of this example, I have a home controller in this app, and it's basically the controller name and then the action that you want it to actually request to. So in an MVC pattern, there's a model, there's a view, and a controller. The controller is kind of the construct that generates the HTTP request, and then it goes to a specific action to actually display the specific view for that action itself. So that's kind of the quick and dirty approach to how that works. The root 2 is how you would write that with the colon, and then you pass in the controller name, and then the hashtag, and then the action name. So in this case, it's just a static controller for me. More dynamic controllers with full RESTful routing, you'll commonly see this in Rails apps that if you generate a resource, it's going to be like a post resource. That's going to be something dynamic, and it's going to have all these out of the gate when you generate that. So if you say Rails scaffold, generate scaffold like posts, it's going to generate this and then have all this stuff just ready to go. Looks like I forgot to update some of the docs. I copied and pasted some of the docs here just for brevity's sake. So posts. So the idea here is it generates a get, post, patch, delete routing structure. So that's pretty much RESTful in that case. Maybe missing one here. But yeah, and that translates in the Rails world to an index action, a show action, a new action, edit, create, update, and destroy actions. So those are all actions you can take on a resource, whether it's just getting data back from a database or updating it in a database and deleting it or etc. So all that stuff. The neat thing with that is when you generate this resource, it actually generates URLs for you, and it's like a part of what you can use in the Ruby on Rails ecosystem, whether it's in helpers, or those helpers can be used in views, and they kind of look like this. So if you're used to Rails at all, you might know what these are, but essentially this translates to a specific convention used in Rails that's following a controller pattern. So on the index action, this would generate the index path. So if you go to index, it's going to list all the posts typically, and that's just going to be a list or a collection of posts that get generated. So on, like, say for a new action, if you want to create a post, you could go to post new, and this generates the route for that. So it'd be controller would go to the new action on the controller and then have the Ruby and HTML come back based on what that is. Typically when you go to a new path on a Rails app, a convention is to show a form of some sort. That's going to be the entry point for data to get into the app from some sort of user or just the backend user. If it's only for yourself, you never know. The idea with that is just giving you a route, a RESTful route to generate that data, submit it securely to a database, and save it on that action. So when you go from new, typically that's going to be post to a create action or a post HTTP request, and then that eventually gets saved to the database in that action. So that's the high level overview of Rails in a nutshell. It's just you follow these conventions, it seems to do the same thing every time, and it's just a pattern to uphold to. And it may seem like I'm skimming through this very fastly, but the more you work with it, the more it's going to be, it's just going to click. You get used to seeing certain ways things are written in the URL and know exactly where those things are at in your app, whether it's on a controller level or not. And sometimes there's obviously give and take with that if you need something more custom, but that's just kind of how it works in the Rails world. Rather than reinventing the wheel every time, Rails is big about following conventions, so you can go ahead and hit the ground running and move. And in a team sake, for instance, there's just an equilibrium amongst everyone that understands it. So if that makes sense, I hope it does. So yeah, so you get these URLs and paths for free. This could be switched to URL to give you an absolute URL as well. You get both for the path and the URL. So the path is just going to be a relative path, meaning the whole URL of the website isn't in the path. Instead, it's just a path to the thing. The URL is going to be complete. Resources kind of take care of all that in one line, which is cool, but you can also declare them all in line if you want. The same is true. I mean, you can just do the same in a block fashion. So you could say resources categories here, resources tags. It's the same thing, just a different way to declare it if you want to save space. This seems less common to me. I haven't seen this a bunch in the wild, but it is one thing to keep in mind if you need to. Additionally, there's a resource. So that's more of a singular resource. And that's kind of a common thing if you don't necessarily need a collection of records in the database. So it's more of this is a specific thing I'm going to only query, and I won't need to reference the ID for it. So that's commonly like a profile or something. So instead, you wouldn't get an index action or a collection in that case. So you'd have just a show, new, create, edit, update, and destroy. These are neat because the default here is the show page instead of just the index page in typical RESTful routing. It gives you the same advantages of resources. You just don't necessarily need that big collection index view. It's just not necessary. It's more of a singular resource in this case. So putting it to practice, it seems kind of complicated, but it's really quite simple. You just, instead of having Certain actions you just skim through and remove a few since you don't need them. Let's see. Namespacing and scoping. So typically in an app, there's probably a place you want to just scope something that isn't really publicly visible. Maybe you want to manage something in the back end, whether it's updating records on the fly or changing some user to subscribed or not, if you need to manually, for instance, is kind of a thing. A lot of apps have this, you just never see it. It's just because they'd rather spend the money to put it into their own app than outsource it to another service or some sort of provider and spend a lot of manual labor doing something like that. If you can automate it usually and your business is doing well, it's worthwhile. So if you want a specific path for resource that can contain something like other resource, typically it's a namespace route. And in this case, it's common to use admin for that. And I often do this for, say, WebCrunch. I'll actually have an admin space where I can see who's commented on the blog or who is editing, or what the latest drafts I have for the blog are up. And I'll save those, and they don't make it to the published state per se, but it is a space I can kind of just do some work and have things ready to go if I need to almost have some scheduled downtime or something. I still have something I could be pretty much ready to publish if I need to and want to do something more streamlined. So that allows me to do that, and it keeps people from coming to a path they shouldn't if they're not an admin per se. And going way back to the top, this is what that kind of does. I kind of skimmed over this. There's this Lambda function that I put on part of this authenticate method, which comes from devise. It basically just says, once you're signed in, we're going to loop through all the users that are. And if that user is an admin, they can enter this path. And this is only just right now mounting the Sidekick gem that I use just for background processing is what that's for. But in here, you could put a ton more, like just additional resources for your app that you can manage that either see public eye or don't. So articles, for instance, I'd put here, but I'd also put articles here because I'd want like everyone to see articles. But on the admin, I want to only be like the creation or editing side of that. So you could scope it to those sections as opposed to just having it all publicly accessible and checking if that user is an admin every time on that front. So you could do it from the routing section instead, which saves a lot of time and logic, I would say. Let's see. So namespacing essentially just adds a param to the URL. So you just have this parent object or parent name that comes before everything else. And the same is true for your helpers. So you have this like admin articles path routes to the admin articles index. The same is true for new and creation, editing, showing, all those things. The typical RESTful CRUD pattern in a Rails app. Commonly, if you want to do something that's admin specific again, like I was just explaining, I'll scope that to a module. And a module in Ruby is just a way to kind of group something into a folder, if you think about it, at least in Rails. And the way you could do that is kind of just make a namespace in this fashion. So it would be written like this in the controller, and then you could house it in a subfolder within the controllers folder instead of actually just in the controllers folder, if that makes any sense. That's just an organization pattern. It doesn't really affect logic at all. It's just a great way to organize stuff and make it clear for you and whoever else might be working on your project that this is part of the admin space as opposed to just a generic articles controller where oftentimes I'll separate concerns and have two controllers that are like, say, article. I'll keep one in the main articles folder, and that's just going to be responsible for like index and show. So I'll list articles, I'll show articles that anyone could see without logging in or doing anything. And then on the admin side, I'll do more of the updating and deleting and editing patterns. So those will just live in the admin space. Only I can edit those or whoever else is an admin. And that's common to use. It's just more of an organization thing, if you think about it. And you could pass scope inline too if you don't want to do this module thing like this. There's tons of different ways to write that. Recommend to check out the docs if you really need alternative patterns there. So nesting routing is totally possible. You can do this, to infinity and beyond, basically. But the recommended pattern is to keep it no more than 3 levels deep. The reason being is that just gets long in the URL structure. You need to pass an instance of post and a category in some cases where, you have this long ass URL. You need to pass that, both those model instances, which end up being an ID, and display those. So if you have 3 or more, imagine, passing 4 different things. It just gets tedious and cumbersome. So you don't want to do that too much. There is such a thing as shallow nesting. I don't have that really here. It's in the docs. Basically just, you can nest, but then it regroups things and creates a shorter URL as a result. Check the docs more for that. But in essence, this is the routing paths and structure this creates. So if you do nest, you get these blocks. So we've got, like, say, categories. This automatically converts the pluralization side of it and the singulars side of it based on just how Rails works, which is pretty neat. There's a lot of magic there. But we've got categories, and then you get the ID of the category. So here we need to pass the instance of that to even get to this URL. And eventually what you want to get to is the post index. So that would be like /categories. And since we're namespacing it or nesting it here, you need to pass the ID for a specific category. So if I had a category of, like, I don't know, web development, within that would have its own ID probably. And then that's going to be its own record that has post associated with it. So each post will have a category, and that ID on it is going to be this one. So that's how you query for it. So that just continues down the path. We got post new, the same thing. You need a category instance to get to that path, since you're going to be on this path, this route. And just, it gets complex. The more you nest, the more complex the URL structure and patterns get. So you notice I use URL here. Like I mentioned before, you can use path as well. It doesn't matter. Commonly, the URL pattern is commonly used in mailers because you need an absolute URL in an email. If you think about it, your email isn't hosted on your app, so you need that full path to get people to go to the right place. So that's why those exist for the most part. But you can use each or. And then that's just the full CRUD pattern of that, how that would work. I figured I'd write it out just to make it a little more clear. I could share this file with y'all as well. And then finally, not finally, but routing concerns allow you to declare common routes that can be reused inside resources and routes. So if you've used any type of concern or a polymorphic association in the past, this is kind of that practice. So commonly you put UBL in the naming structure, so commentable or taggable. It allows you to basically apply this to either any resource that you want. So say I have articles and comments, or let's say articles and, I don't know, I'm trying to think of something else that would need comments. Documents, I don't know. So articles and documents. So you have those two resources and you want to apply comments to both. Instead of adding and rolling new comments for each and having like a singular kind of construct, you can apply a commentable polymorphic association and apply it to just all of that. So it allows you to kind of just resource, use that resource instead of, and being less duplicative, if that makes sense. So in this case, you could write it just the same way like this, and pass an array if you want more than one. It just allows you to do more than once. And comments, for instance, would be applicable to, like I said, articles and documents. So you could apply that in that case. So that would eventually basically be the equivalent to this. So say you'd had messages and articles. Here I use messages, but this would just append that to both. And then if you want, there was images here, but you could just do taggable too. So we don't even really need that. It's just kind of a something like that. Allows you to kind of just append those as you need to. So that's how that would work. I haven't used that a ton. I need to kind of investigate with that a little more. So if it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about, that's probably accurate. So it's okay. I have done, polymorphic associations, but I didn't really know you could apply them on the routing level, definitely on the model level. So it's interesting. On top of your RESTful actions that are part of just the typical resources pattern, you can add more. So using this member block, you can add any type of request here. So a get, post, patch, delete, whatever you want. and then just name it. And you get, for free, you get this automatic URL and params generation. So you get those all built in. And the same is true for a collection. So say you're doing a search and you want to return more than one result, so you can do that. And a collection is the term to use there on that block. Allows you just to return a collection of results as opposed to just more of a singular RESTful route. So you might do something like that. Your controller needs a lot of work to get that to work, but it is something you could do. And then finally, you can do non-RESTful routing, which is common. It's always, I don't know, I hear feedback you should never do this in a Rails app, but I think you can do whatever the hell you want. So a quick way to add something is just basically, have your basic request you're thinking of, just a GET request or a post, whatever you want to do, and just pass whatever you want it to be. In this case, it would be like my ID here. You can pass the signifier. This would actually, I think I have this wrong, like that. You could pass a param that's the ID and then go to the user's controller and the dashboard action, just kind of giving you a place to go for, say, a specific user, or if you're logged in or something like this. This is a path you can do just to make something completely custom. And you can go wild with options here. Like here is one you could pass called defaults. Defaults are a great way to just return a specific file format if you want, or something of that nature. There's more options you could pass here, but this one in particular is the one I went with for the demonstration. That sometimes in JavaScript apps, for instance, you just want JSON to return, JSON in the world. And for instance, sometimes I'll be working in a Vue app, and a specific page I'll mount a Vue app, and I just want JSON to return. And instead of using like the JBuilder instance, you can do something like this that just returns whatever on that person. It's a little limiting because the JBuilder stuff, you can basically pass anything you want, but that's just one way to do it if you wanted to. Finally, you can name routes. I keep saying finally, we're almost done, but naming routes, you can do. Basically, you just pass your typical parameters and your URL pattern that you want it to associate to. So whatever the thing is, name it. It's going to go to whatever controller in action, and then you pass this as property, and allows you to name whatever you want it to. So this would ultimately just be like a logout path that just automatically assigns itself to this kind of routing structure. The same is true here if you want to override parts of a specific resource. The way to do that is to first pass the same resources. So it needs to be users. Notice the users here and users here. It needs to override this pattern. And to do that, you pass this first to do so. And here you could just say, instead of a typical user, you could say pass the user name, which would be just kind of a dynamic property in this case, to user show, as opposed to like their user ID, and allows you to just say, instead of the ID, I want to get your username instead, to display that in the URL. So instead of like users1, it'd be users and WebCrunch for the username if it were WebCrunch. More advanced stuff coming soon. I figured I'd just give you a quick overview of what's involved here. There's tons of of constraint, these things called constraints you can add, different named routing, whatever you want basically under the sun. There's so much to do here. So I might do a part 2. I think as far as advanced constraints go, this really only applies that I've seen when you're dealing with like IPs, different IPs, if you want to block people or bots or whatever, or even translations you can deal with different way. So it's all kind of interesting. You can mount different apps at specific points. So you can have multiple apps. And then you can even, I remember seeing it, I think you can have multiple routes files and just draw those into one separate file. I've previously worked on an app where that was a thing, where there was 3 files that made up our routing. The app was so big that it took that many. So instead of just this one long ass file, you can multiply it or distribute it amongst different files. So look for maybe another part soon where we talk more advanced about this. I figured I'd just do this. I don't think I did one that was really pertaining to routes in the past. I think it's pretty useful. Once you get used to Rails, it just becomes a little more clear how to use this, how to extend it, and of course how to customize it, which is always a thing that I've struggled with, where the defaults and the conventions are easy once you get used to them, but then what if you need to break those conventions? That's where it gets tough. So hopefully this gave you some insight. More to come. I'll see you guys soon. Peace.